There we go. Well, hello and welcome to our session for April 2021. So if you are following us on LinkedIn or Twitter, you should know that we are celebrating our 7th birthday this month. We are 7 months old, 7 years, sorry, 7 years old. And I think we are proud of having this long run, and we have been consistent with monthly sessions, and our community keeps growing. So I'm pretty happy with where we are. Recently, we changed a little bit the format, going from community choosing the topic to bringing friends from around the world. But COVID gave us this opportunity. With COVID and being everything online, we're bringing here people that we cannot afford to buy a ticket for. So it's good to bring people close to us in Toronto. And point in case, tonight we have Wouter joining us all the way from Netherlands. He is a night owl, and that's why we have this session at 6 p.m. Otherwise, with friends from Europe, we have it during noon. But Wouter, welcome. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to give that to you as soon as I learn how to do that, because, oh, here it is, the button. And welcome. And I am looking forward to this session because legacy code is everywhere. Even after a year of a startup, if you don't have proper thinking in place and proper testing in place, you have legacy code, although you might think you are a startup. So I don't think we are immune to legacy code. So I am personally looking forward to learn a little bit your take on this. So welcome to our group.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, it's really great to be here. Well, virtually. I'll definitely make it. Well, Cheesy has been after me to make it a point to actually go to Toronto and visit, but yes, that's gonna have to wait a bit. So hi, I'm Wouter, and I live in the Netherlands. I live in Haarlem, which most people will only know because it's the place that Harlem in New York was named after. And I live here with my wife, 2 teenage daughters, 1 teenage son, 2 dogs, and 4 cats. And well, the 2 daughters are still awake, but all the rest of them are asleep right now. It's about 11 p.m. But I've been working as a coach for, I'm not quite sure how long.
Don't show age.
I reached 49 by last month. So yeah, I'm still alive. It's still going strong. But so I think I've been doing the coaching thing specifically for about 50 years. And one thing that I found is that no matter where you go, there's definitely code that was there before you, and it's not usually in a great shape. There have been exceptions, but there have been very few exceptions. Anyway, but there's a lot of talk about legacy code. So I'm actually not going to talk about the code bit. I am going to talk about the stuff around that and how we, not so much how we fix the code, because you can either, you can ask Cheesy, or you can read Michael Feather's book, or you can go or the Mikado book or whatever. There's a lot of stuff out there for that. But one thing that is usually the case is that when we talk about legacy, we talk about it in a technical sense. and often it's just a technical problem. And we'll leave the engineers. In fact, sometimes it's the other way around. The engineers will come up and say, "Hey, we need to do a refactor." What does that mean? Well, we're going to throw everything away and start over, which is one of the top worst nightmares of a product owner, I think. I remember like a project that was like 7-8 years ago. It was a beautiful situation where we had to replace one page, and we had to replace it for business reasons, right? The page was loading so slowly, it was actually costing a lot of business on a commercial side. And so we started discussing this with the PO, and he said, "Well, yeah, okay, I'm gonna just take a holiday for 3 months, and I'll see you when I get back." And that was not quite what we had intended. But it does seem to be like the kind of state that's in. Cheesy, I don't want to alarm you, but I think there's a llama attacking you. Okay, so it just to be,
I saw that. Yeah.
So what I want to talk to you about is, something that happened in that project, and that I've been doing in different ways with different customers along the way, is how do I get the product not just to be involved, but to be in control of the process of getting this stuff at least under test. I'm not talking about actually fixing things, but at least getting it under test and making decisions based on priority. And I've got some slides. I'm actually going to share my screen so that you can enjoy them. Let me find the right window again. There we are. So, oh, yeah, lost you. Okay, so by the way, the slides here, you can see at the bottom, there's my Twitter tag, but there's also another one, which is Karel. Karel is not here. Karel is a good friend of mine, and we turned some of this stuff into a workshop, and some of the slides are from that. So you'll see his name. All of the slides that seem to be well designed are his, definitely.
We value your transparency.
Oh yeah, well, no. So this one obviously is mine, because it's just an image I got from the internet. Yeah, no, this was legacy code. This is kind of why what we're in, and like I said, mostly from the product side, we try to keep this at arm's distance, and how do we change that? Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to talk through roughly the way that I've done that with a couple of different companies, and what I would love is for you guys to shout out, right? If you say, especially when you say, that's never going to work in my situation, just shout out, and we can have a little discussion about how that's different, and what you would do there, because that makes it interesting. And otherwise, basically, you're just listening to me, which is going to get boring soon. Right? So, except for the kittens, this is the state that we're in, and that's roughly the state I think that we're usually in when we talk about legacy. So, from a product point of view, basically, if you want to release, you got to wait a month, right? If you want to get new features in, it's going to take a long time. Or like the PO I was talking to on Tuesday, he said, "Well, look, he's a sales guy as well. Every time I demo to a customer, I know roughly where people make changes, but it doesn't matter, because they would change something on this side of the of the product, and then something on the completely other side of the product will fall off. Right? It's not a nice situation. And very often, for me at least, when you're in a bad state, you don't really even know what the product does. You might know in broad lines, but the number of times that you when you were working with legacy, that you actually have to go and ask the developers to read the code and try something out before you can say for sure what it actually does is high.
Do you
So-
mean what it does, or how will it react?
How will it react? We have a, you've got a payroll, and how do we actually look at months? Is that a date? Is it always the first of the month? Do we, or does it actually, the payroll is actually run on the 5th? So where does that start? Where does that end? And how do we, if we have to make a change, what happens if we move the running of the payroll like 2 days later? Will it actually have impact on the data or not? This sounds if you've got a system that you know well, and that's small enough, and that's well tested, this cannot be an issue, but it very, very, very often is, right? So I'm going to start from the worst case, in which is we don't really know what it does. So, and Kyle called that the mental breakdown, which is a funny. In our workshop, we used an app. When we use one that is very well regarded, so no one will blame us and tell us that we were explicitly saying that their app was shit. So we use Spotify. They have a good name. What I've been doing as a first step in that sort of situation is to do something really basic, is list out what the functionality is. And that is really simple. You look at the application. So this is Spotify. This is the home screen. What functions do we have? Right? And if we look at search, what exactly are the high-level functions that we have? I'm always a little. It's a little embarrassing because you've got the feeling that you really should know this, but when I did this, for instance, a couple of years ago at BMW for their app, the first iteration was really good, and we got a pretty good overview with multiple people together in about an hour. So we got a nice little view of what the system was doing, but it had to change drastically as soon as we got other people in. There were whole functions missed. Sometimes they were missed because they were not visible to the user. For instance, where does the update fit, right? But also we simply missed whole chunks of functionality that were in there, but only happened for certain types of users, and not everyone was aware of that, and yeah, that sort of thing.
Is that because the on one screen you can fit different teams with different product owners from different areas with different goals?
Yeah. So interestingly enough, the default example for coding for testing is very often like a login screen, right? Especially if you do like the end-to-end test. I think that only looking at the functionality for the logging and the connection to a car, it took like 3 iterations to get through all the possible options. And that were just the user visible options, because there were also things that happened in the backend that we'll get to later if we go into detail. But and there was teams working on functionality that's more marketing related, and those teams in this particular company were, half of them were external. So they basically just got the code base, and they could either build a piece of functionality within an existing page, or they could add a whole new feature flow, or and at some point nobody has an overview, especially, which often happens if there's no standards of documentation, if there's you know, if the most complete version of the overview that we had to start with came from the UX department, and that was simply because they had been trying to do a redesign, so they had to at least move through every variation of a page to do that.
At least someone.
So
Yes.
Walter, Walter, when you found those people who said, well, hey, there's a couple of gaps there. You haven't taken into account this functionality. You haven't taken into account this one. Basically, you're finding additional stakeholders. Did that trigger you to go and look for even more people who were left out of the initial conversation?
Yeah. So what we did is, like, we basically started with just an A0 paper on the wall and people putting on stickies, right? Like,
And
because,
A0
I'm still an agile coach. It needs to be
A0 for people in North America is large.
Yeah.
Oh,
not everyone knows that. Yeah, those terms are different.
Oh yeah, a very large piece of paper on the wall. And as you can see, at some we put that on the wall, and first we got like a initial group in, and then we kind of put it very centrally, and then just walk people past it from different teams, different POs. In this case, you'd say it's a single app, one PO. No, there's 20. And some of them are in different parts of the world, right? So when we got the first version of that in the US, complete-ish, it wasn't changing much anymore. We actually turned it into something a little nicer, a little more structured, and we started distributing that digitally so that we could get the German and the Chinese input, that sort of thing. It ended up, I think this was one of the first cleaned up versions that we distribute. It's very vague. It's not the size of your screen or your eyesight. It's simply that BMW really doesn't like it if you share their information. So I don't know why. But anyway, so what we do is we kind of got this first overview. In a few weeks' time, we got that, and we started looking at what kind of tests were already being done. And some of the tests were manual, and some of the tests are like developer tests and automated, and some things aren't tested at all.
So Wouter, what are we seeing on the screen? What do the colors represent?
So in this case, for instance, if there's no color, there's no tests at all. So if there's a few, I don't know whether you can actually see my mouse.
Yeah, it's on the second column. There's a few. Yeah.
There's a few here. There's a few here. So there's no tests at all. I think, if I remember correctly, and please, it doesn't really matter, right? So I think the dark blue versions, I am colorblind, so the dark blue colors were the things that we cannot test without being in a car. That was a separate category there. The green ones were the ones that we had in the manual tests, and there was a different version of blue where we had end-to-end automated tests. And I don't remember what this color was. So, but we started looking at all of the tests that we had, and we started just putting those colors in. So, if you look at the Spotify thingy, you start up at a very high level, and it doesn't really matter like how good the tests are, because we're not there yet. We're just looking at, do we have something there? And you just start coloring it. I don't remember where that picture went. So that was the first. That's the first iteration. We don't really do anything. We just keep the very high level functionality out. We pick that out, and we look at what we're already doing. The next thing was that there were huge, gaps and uncertainties in the testing. Even when there were manual test cases defined, it turned out that first of all, they weren't being run. That was one, and a lot of them were out of date. So there were test scripts on how you would go manually through the features, but they didn't work because the feature had changed since the scripts were coined. So we needed more information about what was actually happening in there. But the first thing we did was, okay, so if we have this functionality, where do we focus first? And it, BMW, they were releasing 3 times a year when they started, and they spent like 6 weeks on a round of testing, and some of that was 2 weeks of that was testing in the car, which was hard to replace. But it takes a long time. So we started. We can't do everything at once. So you started looking at where you need to go first. At that point, I had a couple of really good testers that we got in. Matt Heuser, I know he's fairly well known in the agile testing community, and Karen Johnson. And Karen came up. She's come up with this acronym for how do we think about priorities, which is really good. A really nice rule of thumb thing. RC, 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 RC. That's one RC too many. So you look at, but you look basically at, what is the risk, whether that be, because it's something you changed recently, so you might have broken it. Whether it's something that, if it's broken, you can't use it, like the login or the install, or when it's risky, if the payment function fails, very often we think that's a big issue, so we might want to put more attention to that. Configuration sensitive, because if you don't control your environments, which you often don't when you're in a legacy situation, things can break surprisingly just because you put it in production. I had that with a team like a couple of months ago. They were very enthusiastically implementing feature toggles, but they were fortunately not versioning them or keeping track of which one was enabled in which environment, and suddenly something came into production and suddenly failed. That happens. But stuff that you've touched recently, or just things that often fail, right? Every legacy system has places where it's more sensitive to failure. And it doesn't really matter too much, but the having a short code like this helps you to at least focus on different areas where you might be running a risk, so that you can pick out one of the features that you you want to start with. For me, that was really important because another one of the big risks of dealing with legacy is that we do it in a big bang, right? We'll just do a rewrite. Or as the company I was working with last year said, oh yeah, we'll just keep on running, and we have 1,500 test cases, and we're just going to automate all of them using Selenium, and then everything will be fine. Just give us a year or two. That's not going to be a very effective way of dealing with things. So you've got to be focused, and you've got to do this iteratively. What I did at BMW is I started doing story mapping with them for existing features. I basically tried to get people to acknowledge that we really don't know in detail what these features are doing. So we're going to actually do discovery of the existing features using the type of tools. And this is, of course, I was an agile coach there, so I was trying to teach them to do this for new shit, right, for new features. So I kind of took a shortcut and started using it for the old features, so I could teach them the tool while dealing with this. Not the only way to do it, but for me, it turned out to be really effective because you can, a story map really links directly to major features. I'm not going to go into too much detail about what a story map is, because that's a whole topic, a whole separate topic. And
I think people here know that.
Yeah, exactly. So, but the difference with when doing this for an existing feature is mostly that you slice it differently, right? Because you already know a lot of that. It's less of a discovery of what the steps in the feature are, but it's more of a or how much business value it's going to be, or for a slice, or how much project risk is going to be covered by it. But you look at other types of testing risk and testing effort to try and create slices through that. That's the major difference, and all of the rest is pretty much the same. So if you do that for Spotify and managing a playlist, you would just map out the existing functionality. Sometimes you do that with the app in hand if you really don't know what happens. Sometimes we actually pause and go into the code to look at something, but we map out the functionality, and like you would do for a regular story map, you try to find things that fit together, and then each of those layers in the map is another layer of the same feature that you can name, and that you can discuss, and that you can use as a basis for your tests. So we would pick up the layer. In most of these cases, the top layer was simply the basic functionality, right? So the most basic version of that feature that we can do. And in a lot of cases, that was the only one that we took in for testing later. But you would see in your heat map, which in this case is hierarchical because that's how I think, but that's definitely not the only way to do it. You would see these things come back. Like I said, each of those slices in the story map becomes its own level in the heat map, and then we decide what to do with it. And this is, I already warned Cheesy, but I think there's more people in here that might be surprised or might disagree. Each of those slices can be an end-to-end test. And I actually, in this case in particular, recommended that they do that. And I've done that with other clients as well. Not so much because I'm a big fan of end-to-end tests, but because if you don't have anything and you don't have confidence, then putting in the structure that will give you some of that confidence is much more important anything else. So
Is Cheesy worried about that?
Cheesy is saving up. No. So this is, like I said, this is the first step. Very often, only the top of the top slice of the story map needed to be in our set of tests, and very often by defining them, we would actually reduce the number of test cases that was there, and that I think is a really important bit. We'll get to how you go into detail, switching to example mapping a little later. But for instance, my current client, they started out with 1,500 test cases. They ended up with 50 end-to-end tests. Right? By making it very explicit, and by creating the structure and by acknowledging the differences in risk, you can actually also use that to limit the amount of effort put into end-to-end testing, which is not always, in my experience, an easy thing to do. I'll skip through this. This is about the testing part. Matt taught me to basically not be too specific in there, but that's a different thing. So an end-to-end test is not necessarily something you always automate. And this is, in the beginning, in my experience, it's better not to do that, because it turns out that we don't really know upfront how it's going to fail. So it's much better if we do a number of these things manually before we even think of putting that in automation. I do think that for a lot of companies, going into automation at some point for a limited number of tests is a really good thing. Mostly because I find that if you don't, they tend to not have the level of confidence that they need. Even if you go and have a really solid developer level testing, and even if the manual regression test doesn't really find any issues, people are really scared of letting go of this sort of thing. So for me, building those is partially a psychological affair. We just we allow that to happen so that people build the level of confidence needed, but we do limit the amount that we get. Anyway,
can you go 2 slides back?
Yeah.
There, it says, once you discovered what is interesting about the functionality, maybe automate. What does interesting mean?
In this particular case, it means the stuff that will or might regularly fail. So a good tester can do exploratory testing along this line, right? And they can find out what is tricky, what is risky, what is what they feel is not what they feel is not solid, or what they feel might fail regularly.
Mm-hmm.
And what I've done here is just, we do like 5 or 6 releases running this test, and we pay attention, right? And then the outcome of that we might automate.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, so I try to make sure that as much of the effort in testing goes into the more detailed type of tests. But like I said, I don't think that that's enough, because people don't feel that it's enough.
Mm-hmm.
So the next level testing, which is where for me it becomes more interesting, because it gets a little further away from what especially companies that don't have a solid test base have, is more of the what I call high resolution tests, right? The type of tests that go end to end are by definition fairly low resolution. They look at the functionality from a distance, from through the user interface, from the and they can be executed by a human. We can automate that in the same way, but they will not show all of the detail. Sometimes because they can't always access it, but certainly because if you have too many of those sort of tests, it will be very slow and it will be very brittle. So we can't really zoom into every detail. It's if you've got a form with address information, then you will have an end-to-end test that fills in the form and goes to the next stage. If you have a high resolution test, it will test all of the variations of validation of a phone number, right? For instance. But how do you get that? Because that's a level of detail.
But all the variations of the phone number, you don't need an end-to-end test to test that, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
It could be something much smaller, like a unit test. In fact, it probably should be.
No, that's exactly what I mean. So the end-to-end tests, they are low resolution. You don't go into that sort of detail. You don't need that sort of detail. And it is much, much cheaper to do that with lower level tests, which can either be unit tests or, as we're going into now, the type of example-based tests that we know from BDD, right? So, like I said earlier, right, that first slice, that's useful for an end-to-end set. Most of the variations on the theme, we're not going to test like that. With the company I'm working with right now, when we started, like I said, 1,500 test cases for the manual testers. 50 were selected as these sort of like end-to-end flows, right, and a high-level representation of the features. About 900 of them we deleted after verifying that there were already unit tests in place that covered them. Mm. And this is a good situation because this, there was quite a good base of unit testing. There was quite a good practice there. Sometimes that's not there, right? But it pays to find out. It saved a lot of time. People were actually, I was just saying about, it would be phone numbers, email addresses. People were actually manually checking those while there were already unit tests in place. So one of the things we did was we looked at what was happening in testing. We put it on the big chart. We dragged the developers in front of that chart, and we started discussing what was happening there. And they thought it was really funny. But yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So from a product perspective, like a product owner's perspective, do you ever go through and evaluate the probability of a problem as well as the impact it may have on a business? Like if you're working on a banking application, for instance, if one calculation is off by a couple of pennies or a dollar, then there's a big problem. But it's a lot different if there's a spelling mistake in somewhere, right? So they have to do that evaluation. So do you ever do that sort of evaluation of probability and impact by slice or by component in order to figure out where you actually need to concentrate?
Yeah. So yes and no. I've done that sort of thing in some companies, especially in more the e-commerce focused ones. But very often we never get to that point. And this is, so it's really good if you have data, to use it, right? So, and the data could be like, if we've got numbers for code churn, then we can look at, where we do the most changes. So that's part of where the risk is. If we talk to the PO, we can find out, well, what are the areas where there's a bigger chance of it having a big impact on the company. And very often, it's the testers that do that and that give that information. 9 times out of 10, people do not actually discuss those sort of risks. So I tend to stick for a long time on just the rule of thumb, opinions, basically. PO together with a tester and a developer, they pretty much know what to where those risks are. But if you have the numbers, it's really good to be more thorough about that.
So it's more tribal knowledge versus actually building out, taking the slices or the underlying systems like core features, configured features, things that are changing, do a little bit of an architectural diagram, like you've done a functional breakdown essentially of the product. But then how does that layer into the architectural structure underneath that's driving it? Like, don't you have to worry about it, or is it just tribal knowledge sort of figuring out what your strategy is going through?
Yeah, I start with, good. That's a good name for it. I start with the tribal knowledge because I want to get this on the road really quickly. And I'm more concerned with getting the getting the wheels turning than doing exactly the right thing. With a few companies where I've gone through this for a longer time, usually we can see that the first guesses are good, but that there's gaps. So we either we see that because we still get defects in certain places where we weren't expecting them, or we see that because there's indeed, like I said, there's components that are more susceptible to error that have impact where we didn't expect them.
Sure.
But yeah, I tend to not go there until we're much further along in the game.
Right. So better to get started than to be perfect, in other words.
Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. Cool, thanks.
Yeah, that's why I really like the Karen's like very short RCRCRC. It's just a quick rule of thumb. Everyone understands it. Everyone brings their knowledge to it, and we can get going. I can. So one of the companies I was working with is very much focused on being data driven, right? But even there, I think we were 9 months in before we actually started like comparing where the bugs are with where we're focusing with testing. Not because they don't want to, but because it takes a long time either to get the data or get it to it in a shape that you want. I tend to find that most companies that value data tend to forget that you need a model that that describes describes the system that you're getting data for. So if you're that mature, absolutely. But in my experience, that takes a long time to get there. Yeah. So so what I tend to do again, there's a second like line. I'm trying to teach the company to become better at their requirements process as well while we're doing this, and get used to certain practices. But when diving into the places where you need more detail, I've been using example mapping. It's slightly less known than story mapping, but it's getting to be really popular. Basically, it's going through the BDD process of finding the examples, finding the scenarios that you that describe the feature, but doing that in a more structured way so that you can go through it quickly. That looks, that looks something like this. So you look at what for a specific story, and we have the stories in our story map. You look at what the rules are, and you find specific examples that show the boundaries of those rules. And if you do that right, that's very easy to move that into something that you can implement, so that you can test at a detailed level. So I'm not sure whether this is readable. Let me go here. So an example could be, if we want to generate automatic names for a playlist, there's a few examples here that, if there's already a number 1, then it's going to be number 2. And if there's a number 2, it's going to be number 3. That sort of thing. So you think of very explicit examples of a targeted piece of business logic, so that you can target that, and you can write these sort of low-level, high-detail tests for that.
Wouter, I often find though that once you go through this exercise and you come up with these, the team's gut reaction then is to go out and write end-to-end through the UI automation to try to test this, which in many cases is very counter to actually delivering software.
Absolutely. So what I kind of forbid that. So, but officially you've got 2 types of scenarios in BDD. One of them is the journey type of scenario, and that's one of those things that people are always implementing through the UI, right? It's I click here, I fill in that, I click there, I go to the next page, that sort of thing.
Very disastrous as well, right?
Yeah. For me, that is not what you do if you do behavior-driven development, right? And if you look at these sort of examples, they are very, very focused, and they call those illustrative examples. So they actually illustrate a business rule. There should not be anything in here that has anything to do with the UI, but they very much focus on the business rule. This is, of course, for like a Spotify type app. Very often, I've worked with a lot of financial companies. So the business rules here are, calculations, and the examples are tables, right? But what you write here, I would always implement using unit test technology, right? So a unit testing framework. And very often these things are implemented at what I would call a component test, or what in the old days you would call a service test. So it's a test that is at a slightly higher level of integration than a unit test, as in it tests a bunch of objects together. It is not an integrated test. It does not need a running system. They run in milliseconds, which is why they're both cheap to write and they're cheap to run. So if you've got these sort of scenarios, right, if we want to know that the next playlist is going to be playlist number 3, the test itself is short and to the point. There's nothing there that needs a user interface.
And meaningful as well.
And meaningful as well. Yes, it's a much better description of what the actual intent of the program is, right, of the system is, than a journey test, which if we're looking at the BDD, right, the journey test basically is written in the language of the user interface, while the illustrative test is written in the domain language of the application. Which means that, you know, a playlist here is a thing. A playlist name is a thing. It doesn't talk about, you know, a form or anything like that. So yeah, absolutely, Cheese. So all of these are hard maybe to surface, especially if you've got an existing system, but they're really cheap to implement, and that's a good thing. And if you've got a bunch of those, again, we extend our heat map, and we see that we've got that covered. And the more of that we have covered, the more confident we can be that we've got our system under control. But also, the more that we've put these sort of tests in place, the quicker we can deliver. And all the while, as a PO, you've got the overview, and you can make informed decisions on where to go. For instance, if you know that in a month or two you're going to be working on a new feature in a certain area of the system, before that you might actually invest a little in servicing what the current functionality is, and making sure that it's well covered in tests. So yeah, so that's pretty much it. And then iterate. So
your cases are starting from all manual testing, right? And how to start looking into automation?
Yeah, but it depends on the organization, right? So like I said, if we've already got a good unit test coverage, then we can also use that to reduce our manual testing effort. But even organizations that seem to have things in order with manual testing, in my experience, never ever do, because they never have an overview. They don't know why they're testing things. They actually very often don't know what is actually tested when those manual test scripts are executed. I mean,
True.
take any team that does a manual regression test, and notice how elastic the cycle time for the regression test is, right? Sometimes it takes a week, sometimes it takes a day.
So Wouter, I'll also extend that to say, so many organizations, the first time they start to try to write end-to-end automation, they just take their manual scripts and just convert them straight over. And again, they have no idea what they're testing, or they have no idea if two tests are testing the same thing or not. I mean, it's very common that I've seen as I'm reading through that sort of a thing, they might have 10, 15, 20 tests that are all testing the exact same thing. They're not even aware of.
Yeah, and some of the testers are aware of it, and others are not, depending on how long they've been there. The first thing I do when I see that sort of thing is I actually sit with the tester while they're doing that, and you sit with them for an hour, and you know exactly what's going on, because they'll be spending a half an hour setting up the test data, and then they'll be combining 50 different test cases in one flow, because otherwise they need to revisit that. So the main point here is not so much, for me at least, to get rid of the manual testing initially, but to get rid of a lot of the waste in there, and to make sure that we actually focus on testing the things that we should be testing. And I'm pretty sure that that's well, I know that in all the situations that I've seen, that was not happening.
This is, I mean, what you're actually getting to is a test strategy, which is something that I've worked with, like when I was still living in Belgium, so quite a while ago in the meantime. But this is ultimately, and I do like, I've never heard of the three I call it 3RC. In the meantime, it's easier to remember. I need to remember only 3 characters instead of 6. So, but that actually gives you all the information that you need to define that strategy and to say like, okay, hang on, we got some challenges there, we got some challenges there, that we are fairly confident in. Whether or not there are tests available for it doesn't really matter. If you're never using, if you're never changing it, and it works, and it always has worked, so why would you spend your valuable time and effort in that area, right? So so what you're actually doing is you're going kind of backwards, right? You're starting from your strategy, and then you're identifying, okay, hang on, what do we have? What are we covering? Where is the overlap? Where can we get rid of this? And how can we push things down lower on the V model, which is more and closer to the code, right? So sounds like an interesting strategy.
Yeah, I've said a few times, I have like a second agenda. I want to teach them how to do this for new features as well. So I'm kind of like trying to do 2 things at once, but it seems to work fairly well because, like, it's one of the agile tricks, right? Where you make it very visual, what exactly the current state is, so that you know what to work on.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
you make it easy because it starts from something they know rather than something new that they're building.
Yeah, that's that. I'm lazy. I don't want to, I don't want to have to think of a new thing to. I don't have to an additional thing to teach people. It doesn't have to be a story map. You can do event storming, right? Or you can use the if they are there, user journey maps or whatever. But you need something to actually define what a feature means in this particular case.
yeah,
And my main finding every time is that everything is implicit.
yeah. So
first,
So Walter, one question that I had, and it was really in the beginning, and but the conversation that we're having right now actually is leading into that as well, or is attached to it at least. One of the kind of assumptions that we're making, especially with the story map, is that well, when we have a set of functionality that is somehow associated with, because this is how we define our slices, we're now going to assume as well that the code that is implementing that is also all similar, right? And we're going to assume if we test that functionality, then we test the code underneath, but that code might be used somewhere else. So obviously there's a couple of shortcuts we need to take, and this is way better than the previous state. But have you seen some of those challenges pop up, and how do you potentially address those?
I was with a company that was on Monday, but they had a product that was mostly about how do you say that, data processing. So pretty much every user flow was read data, enrich data, visualize data, and export it again. That was pretty much what every feature that they had at this point. While every slice was a different, for instance, different data types, or different types of metadata that could be added, or different visualizations that. So when we started with the heat map, there was only one entry in there, and then we started with the story map, and then every slice turned out to be like a top level feature for the product. So I think that was I kind of we discussed roughly what the product was before we did the session, so it was kind of expected. It was still very useful to start with the story map and actually the end user focused flow, because a lot of the developers were only focused on one processor basically, and not very much about the integration between the different processors. So it helped by making that visible, and actually by, again, some of the, in this case, the end-to-end was very much component to component. I think there was no user interface necessary, but having those really helped because they were running into a lot of like integration issues between the different components that they had.
Yeah.
But it came out differently than if you have a more UI focused application.
Mhm. Oh, this was an interesting take, Wouter. Thanks for bringing it to us. I think it is getting a little late here, and people are probably getting
Later in Holland.
their time. Well, he agreed to do it at this time. I don't know.
I know. I think that's why I expected it to happen at noon.
Yeah.
I definitely am much more awake at midnight than I am at dinner time or right after.
So thank you for this. Unless there's any other question, but I'm thinking we're probably wrapping up here. So thanks, Wouter, for sharing with us this experience, and thanks everyone that joined us on this session. Have a great
Thanks everyone.
rest of the evening, or have a good night.
Have a good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Keep
Bye.
track of your cats tonight, Wouter.